called the E.T. scenario. And this one, isn't that cute? Now, before I get into this, both for the purpose of the tapes that are being made and also for those of you that are probably wondering, what have you wandered into here tonight? My name is Chuck Missler, and I make my living as an electronics executive. And normally it's appropriate in a meeting like this to sort of set aside personal things. But in this case, because of the nature of the material that we're going to deal with, I thought it might be useful for me to tell you a little bit about what professional background I'm coming from. Most of us that know each other around here on a first-name basis know each other in a different context. Most of you probably don't realize, what each of us do professionally. And one reason I'm dressed here is I've got a driver waiting, and I'm going to have to leave here to catch a plane to New York, or I wouldn't be dressed in quite such a, odd fashion for this style of fellowship. I'm a Naval Academy graduate, and I went in the Air Force, spent some time in the defense industry. I'm an electronics nut. When other guys were hopping up cars in high school, I was building a digital computer in my garage. I was a radio ham when I was 9. Anyway, from that background, I evolved into the high technology industries, and in the last 10 or 15 years have made my living turning around troubled high technology companies. I serve as chairman of the board of a company called Western Digital Corporation. By the time these tapes hit the marketplace, it'll also be announced I'll be chairman of the board of a company called Helionetics. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things they're into in a minute. And I sit on the board of Ducommon, which is on the American Exchange, and I also sit on the board of Data. I either am now or have sat on about 12 public boards, and last week was elected chairman of the Computer and Communications Industry Association in Washington. Why am I going through all of this? Well, one of the things that I'd like to explain or relate to or describe is how a guy from my background comes to some of the rather peculiar viewpoints that we'll be talking about before the evening's over. We're going to come to some conclusions, I think, certainly before this 3-evening series is over, that are rather startling. We're going to come to some rather fantastic conclusions. I'm going to try to describe why, despite my high technology background, despite the fact that I spend most of my business life in corporate boardrooms, why it is that I believe in the supernatural. I'd like to describe why it is that I believe that you and I are alive at the most exciting time in human history. Now, that's a strange thing to say, because most of us that are well informed at all are very aware that our world right now is a mess. We can talk about food, we can talk about population, we can talk about pollution, and as we list mankind's problems that are facing us today, they're really hairy. In fact, there are people that believe that a couple of interesting premises, follow me. They believe, first of all, that the problems facing mankind are global, not regional. Now, that's not hard to argue with. The ones I've just rattled off are not local problems. They're global problems. The second premise these thinkers would espouse is that the problems of society are characterized by long lead time solutions. In other words, whatever solution we hope to find, it's going to take a long time to achieve. From those two premises, which we could hardly argue with, they argue that it's probably a matter of 2, 3, 4 decades before the planet Earth is under a single administration. And the problem is, how do we get there nonviolently? That's the way the problem is posed by many. And there are many intelligent intellectuals that see life that way. If we shift from what I'll call the social sector, let's shift to the economic sector. That's something that I know perhaps more about. Let's take the strongest nation on the planet Earth, the United States. Our federal deficits are in the order of $200 billion per year. And most of us, I think, are anticipating a reasonable economic recovery over the next year or two. But the really informed thinkers are convinced that we're facing a very serious economic dislocation in this country sometime over the next few years. I sit on a board with Bill Simon, the former Secretary of the Treasury, and many of you may have read his book, A Time for Truth. A premise of which is that Washington is out of control and there really is no practical way to get it back under control. And that's just the U.S. Talk about the world economy, it's all dependent on the way we conduct ourselves. So we could easily we talk interest rates or federal deficit spending or trade imbalance, we could get into a very, very discouraging scenario there. But let's shift to another area, and that's the military. All of us, I think, independent of maybe certain political persuasions, are sensitive to the fact that there is in place weaponry that can virtually destroy civilization as we know it. That weaponry is not only in the hands of the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the balance of terror, as some people call it, it's also in the hands of many other countries. As early as 1967, Red China launched the first hydrogen bomb in their possession. And the progress by many nations, France, China, others, is well known among those that follow those kinds of things. And I sit on a board with Dr. Edward Teller, and I think most of you have seen him in the news relative, he's sometimes called the father of the hydrogen bomb. The whole predicament we're in which our survival as a nation and as a society hangs heavily on our ability to maintain our strength technologically. And I sat in meetings today even where people are talking about weapons in which if you have a 200-mile-per-second missile coming at you, trying to shoot it with 100,000-mile-per-minute pellets to knock it down, going virtually at the speed of light, the so-called particle beam weapons. The ability to build in effect, a laser gun that can heat something up to over 100 million degrees centigrade for a millionth of a second. Very high degrees, very short time, but I imagine that's smarts. So we're dealing now in a whole, you heard some of this mentioned, I believe, by President Reagan in his speech back last April, and the so-called Star Wars weapons kinds of things. We're moving into an era in which our very society, it's not hard whether you're looking at the social sector, the economic sector, or the military sector. It's not hard to recognize that we're in pretty serious trouble as a society, as a planet. Every once in a while, you sort of get the feeling that men will be reasonable, that despite the fact that there are people around the country that could push a button and wipe out hundreds of millions of people, that after all, people in the final analysis are reasonable. And just about that time, you read about a Korean airliner that reminds you just what we're up against. No remorse, rather severe punishment for people that allowed it to get that far. And you begin to realize that we have we have the power, and it's in the hands of our adversaries, and they're knowledgeable, intensive adversaries. So as you sit as just human beings facing today's world, if you're well read at all, you tend to get worried. So how can you, Chuck, when you see all that, how can you say that this is the time to be alive that's better than any time in human history? What a strange contradiction. How can I say that? Well, that really gets to a viewpoint that I want to build up very slowly and try to make it very rationally. These same scientists that we tend to read about that are in particle beam weapons or thermonuclear fusion or fission or what have you are not long ago had a scientific conference. It happened to be hosted in the Soviet Union, but that's really irrelevant. 84 of the top scientists in the world came together to discuss the possibility of communicating with extraterrestrial intelligence. Doug Wetmore's titled his tape, E.T. Scenario. Let me talk a little bit about extraterrestrial communication. These 84 scientists gathered in the CETI conference, Communication with Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and addressed the technological possibilities of encountering life in some place other than the planet Earth. Now, the proceedings from that conference have been translated into English, and those of you that have very deep technical backgrounds might find it interesting to track those papers down and read it, because what those scientists inadvertently focused on was the probability of life happening by itself. That was not the thrust of the conference. The real idea was, what's the probability of there being life in the universe? What's the probability of it being intelligent enough and powerful enough and so forth? There's about 17 steps you have to go through to get yourself to believe that they might eventually send signals that we might receive, and given that we send those signals, could we understand what they are? And if you've done any technical reading here, that's an interesting problem. If you get signals from outer space, if they're absolutely periodic, then you can assume they had their origin from natural causes. If they're totally random, they're noise. And how do you define the area between? It's an interesting technical problem. But in any case, the conference was extremely interesting because they very clearly demonstrated that the probability of life occurring by itself is absurdly small. Let me give you an example of some of the conclusions. A DNA molecule is regarded as being the key to life itself. It's a very key element in what we call a protein. And it turns out that the DNA molecule can be analyzed quite readily by what's called switching theory. And it turns out that, if I remember, I'm doing this from memory, I believe the DNA molecule has one chance in 10 to the 57th power, I think, of occurring randomly. Well, that's very, very interesting, because those same scientists would tend to agree that the age of the universe is something on the order of 10 billion years. Well, if you're going to try to make a DNA molecule by chance, you have to have you have to deal with a generation, a biological generation. The shorter the generation, the more chances you've got. Let's take, what's the shortest average lifetime, if you were going to take the average lifetime in the history of the universe, what's the shortest lifetime you might use as a mathematical assumption? Suppose to you I said that the average lifetime of a biological organism in the history of the universe is 1 second. You'd argue that's pretty small. That's probably ridiculous. I mean, our lifetimes are nominally, 70 years. Other organisms are very small, but as an average, 1 second seems absurd. Well, if you go through the arithmetic and accept a 10 billion year life of the universe, you'll discover there's only 10 to the 17th seconds. And that's a shock if you haven't done the arithmetic. But let's go one step further. Let's assume that the average lifetime is not 1 second. Let's assume it's not even a millionth of a second. Let's divide a millionth into 1,000 part and talk a nanosecond. Okay? That's still only 10 to the 26th nanoseconds in the history of the universe. So if you accept the random hypothesis of DNA molecules, there wasn't time. Okay? Now, let me try it another way. I happen to have a watch here that, I'm sure many of you here in the audience may be wearing some of the new digital watches. Some of them have calculators built in. Some of you in the audience, I'm sure, have a watch where you can calculate the call rate of return of an option that expires on the third Friday in April, net present value to today. And you think I'm kidding until you can redo that. Now, if I told you that I had such a watch up here, and I said to you, I bought this watch from a store, and that storekeeper got it from a jobber who got it from a manufacturer who had a team of 30 engineers working 2 years to design the parts, the chips, and the microcircuits and what have you to make this watch, you'd say, gee, that sounds reasonable, doesn't it? How many of you would believe me if I told you that's the way I got this watch? Well, see, you're wrong, because that's not really what happened at all. See, what actually happened was millions of years ago, there were random bits of silicon floating through the universe, and random bits of gold and quartz, and an amazing thing happened. Cosmic winds. Now you think I'm kidding, don't you? Listen. They wove these things into numbers. It's amazing because they're culturally compatible with our numbers, you know. It's got, and they all fell together, and it has the time and the date, and it's got an accuracy to, and so forth. Now, obviously, it's hard for me to pull this off with a straight face because as I talk that way, the probability that this watch happened without the skillful intervention of a designer is ridiculous. It's so ridiculous, it's a form of humor, isn't it? And yet, if I put that on my wrist, the design that went into this hand with its self-healing, self-correcting, and self-adjusting servos makes the design of the watch look like a kindergarten's toy. And yet we're not willing to accept the existence of the watch without acknowledging the presence and supervision and care and involvement of an architect, a designer, in fact, many skills. Skills probably greater than are collectively in this audience. I mean, if we sat down, the group of us, yes, there's probably some MOS designers here, and there's some computer programmers that could we might be able to assemble it, but I doubt it. The skills involved are intense. And yet we take this in our society casually because they're available, and we just recognize it's the result of design. Yet we look at the universe. We look at our environment that we live in, the trees, the sun, the birds, whatever. You all have your own sensitivities there. They all bear evidence of design. We see flowers and they're beautiful. Well, that's to attract bees. Then we discover bees are colorblind. And then we say, wait a minute. Not only is there a designer, but he cares. And we could go on and on along this vein, but I'd like to get back to this concept of time because it's going to have a very, very special meaning for us. One of the things I want to do is try to step back and put in broader perspective some of the notions that get in our way at understanding our peculiar predicament, and I don't mean just social, economic, and military. Most of us, well, first of all, philosophers since the beginning of time have argued about almost everything under the sun. Fate versus free will, you name it. There's one thing, though, if you inspect the literature, they all seem to agree on, and that's what we would call the linearity and uniformity of time. It never occurred to them that time was anything but linear and uniform. And you and I, whether we've thought about it or not, make that same assumption. All of us, when we were in school, had to make a timeline. If I had a blackboard here, I could make a mark on the left and draw a line horizontally to the right, and the beginning of that line could be a birth, the end of the line a death, or it could be and various events along the way. It could be the signing of the Magna Carta, or the Declaration of Independence, what have you, right? And because of that, we mentally think of time as linear. No problem so far. Then when we start talking about things like God or eternity, what we assume we mean is that he has no beginning or no end. That is, the line starts at infinity out to the left and goes to infinity out on the right. Most of us, I think, if we were to think of eternity, would think of simply a very long line, a line with no beginning and no end. And that happens to be an unfortunate misconception. Because in the laboratories today, we know that time is a physical property. We speak of space-time. We talk of time going backwards. Some physicists some years ago got the Nobel Prize because they discovered that a positron and electron, which have always thought to annihilate each other, that the positron is really the electron in a time reversal. The concept of time going backwards is something that's very strange to you and I. We have a tough time with that. Pardon the pun. Time is physical. We discover, you've all probably read about the imaginary twin astronauts. One goes on the mission and one doesn't, and he comes back younger than his brother because he's in a different time domain. We know that our time functions are a property of our acceleration and our mass. I don't want to get into relativistic mechanics. The whole idea, though, is that time is a physical property. If you don't have any mass, you have no time. God isn't somebody that just has lots of time. Rather, he's someone outside that time domain altogether. The analogy is maybe like a line, but he's maybe like in a helicopter above it and can see the end from the beginning. He's not in it with just lots of it. He's beyond it in a totally different domain. Now, I've introduced another idea here. Before I do, let me take you on a very famous intellectual excursion. Let's assume that I was able to build a one-dimensional universe. What do I mean by that? My one-dimensional universe, if I had a blackboard, I'd just draw a line. It has one dimension, say left and right. In that one-dimensional universe, I'm going to put a one-dimensional being, just a point on that line. That one-dimensional being can move in that one-dimensional universe very comfortably. Let's, for the purpose of illustration, erase part of that line and leave a break. Our little one-dimensional being can come up to the end of that line, and let's assume he somehow intellectually knows that the line continues after the break, but he also knows that there's no way for him within his one-dimensional existence to cross that gap. A two-dimensional being could come along and pick him up and put him on the other side of that break and freak him out. A miracle has occurred. He has transcended his notions of dimensionality. Okay, let me give you a second example. Let's now build a two-dimensional universe. Visualize it, if you will, like a tabletop. Okay? And let's, in that two-dimensional universe, put a two-dimensional being. A little person that has X and Y but no Z. In other words, he's so long and so wide but no thickness. He's two-dimensional only. And he's in this two-dimensional universe. You all had some of this when you took plane geometry in school. Well, this two-dimensional being in a two-dimensional universe can move in X and Y and be quite comfortable. For the purpose of our discussion, let's make a break in the table, like a dining room table. Let's break it where there was a leaf maybe, and there's a break there. And our two-dimensional being can move right up to the break. He intellectually somehow may know that, gee, there's more two-dimensional universe beyond him, but he can't cross that break, not in his dimensionality. Now, we walk along as a three-dimensional being, and we pick him up and put him on the other side of that break, and he's freaked out. Wow, a miracle's happened. Now I'm going to the third example. One-dimensional universe, two-dimensional. Now let's go to a third-dimensional example. Let's pretend you and I are in a room with no doors and windows. We have a floor, a ceiling, and 4 walls, 6 sides. Now we're programmed in 3 dimensions, and we can move within that 3-dimensional volume in X and Y and Z, as they say, and not get through the wall without the advantage of a door or a window. Let's assume there are no doors or windows. A 4-dimensional being could come along and move us outside that cube without passing through one of those 6 sides. Really. Now we can't visualize that. Why? Because we're programmed in 3 dimensions. And by extension, I can argue that that we speak in mathematics of a hyperspace. Not 1, not 2, not 3, but n dimensions. 4, 5, 6, you can have as many as you like, and the mathematics can be quite consistent. And if I had a blackboard, I could take you through some of that and bore you to death. So another thing, and praise God, there's no blackboard here. Okay. Now, let's assume that you were a creator, and you created a physical environment that had the property of time. And let's assume you put in that environment man. And let's assume you had him there and he now could move through time from his beginning to his end. And you watched him go along that line, if I can speak of a timeline again. But you are beyond that. You are the creator. You're looking down and you can see the end from the beginning, and you watch him trundle along through his time domain. Suppose you wanted to send him a message. You obviously have the technology to get a message to him. How do you let him know it's you? What would you say that would let him know that that message is coming from outside his time domain? What would you do? And the answer is pretty obvious. You're watching him go through time. You know the end from the beginning. So to get his attention, you tell him some things that haven't happened yet. You send him a message and say, oh, by the way, a week from Tuesday, you're going to stub your toe on a curb against a red light, and there's a blue Chevy or whatever, you know. And what happens, he says, wow, how'd he know? Okay? And of course, the more elaborate your construction, the more you're likely to get his attention. Now, I'm going to suggest to you something that has been the most remarkable discovery in my life. And I deal in a lot of technologies, and I do a lot of things that I think are kind of exciting. But the most exciting thing was to discover that I was in possession of a well-documented message of extraterrestrial origin. I have a document here that I can prove to you had to have its origin outside our time domain. We deal with something else, perhaps to help you visualize this, is that we deal with in engineering and mathematics with a thing called a transform. If you saw, those of you that have ever been in a science fair or someplace where you can speak into a microphone and see your sound on an oscilloscope, you know that when you talk, it wiggles. The louder you talk, the louder the wiggles. The higher the pitch, the closer they are. The lower the pitch, the broader they are. And that's fine in theory, but when you actually see the wiggles, it's useless because you're seeing your sound in the time domain, and that's useless for engineering. What you really would like to do, if you're interested in these things, is see it in the frequency domain. Those of you that have bought stereos have probably heard somebody say that my amplifier is flat from 20 to 20,000 cycles, meaning it has a uniform response from the low notes to the high notes. What they have done, they're talking about its frequency response. To get from the real world to the frequency domain, you employ what's called a Fourier transform. In engineering, a problem may not be solvable directly. But if you can transform that problem into another domain, it can often be analyzed there quite readily, and then you transfer back. So you're constantly transferring in engineering, transforming it from engineering, from what we call the space-time domain to the frequency domain. You've probably heard of holograms. Holograms are simply a Fourier transform of an image. And we could talk about Laplace transforms, we could talk about Lorentz transforms, there's all kinds. There's some that transfer time domains. And what I'm suggesting is that it's possible mathematically and it's possible spiritually to have a transform from our time domain into someone elsewhere and back. Have we ever witnessed that? Absolutely. When Jesus Christ entered the room with the disciples after his resurrection, the door was locked, and yet he was among them. They thought he was a ghost. He says, no, handle me and see. A spirit hath not flesh and bone. He was not an apparition. He was tangible. Handle me. He never appeared after his resurrection without eating with them. Was he some kind of transfer function kind of thing? Possibly. That's one way of viewing it. Well, what I'm going to suggest is that we have here 66 books written by 40 authors over many thousands of years. That's demonstrable. 39 of them were translated into Greek 3 centuries before Christ was born. So setting aside Dead Sea Scroll discoveries and other such things, we know that the Old Testament has obviously a very ancient history. The New Testament, the point is that these 40 authors penned 66 books over many, many generations. And yet, as we examine the text, we're amazed to discover evidences of a common design, a common theme, a common structure, secret codes that are placed one place and revealed somewhere else. And perhaps the most dramatic of those is this whole business of foretelling things before they happen. For what purpose? To authenticate its origin. The purpose of this book isn't to tell us necessarily what's going to happen the day after tomorrow. The purpose of this book is to authenticate where it came from and to give us a perspective of what God's plan is for each and every one of us. Okay, now, before I leave this question of time and start getting into maybe some more practical things, I would like to just touch upon one other thing, because it relates conceptually to what we're dealing with here. And that's this. I mentioned that time can go forward or backward. I don't know if you ever thought about it. That's probably not been one of your biggest worries lately, is can time go backwards? But if I told you that time could go backwards, you may think, gee, that's kind of interesting. What do you mean? Well, I mean that time has a positive or a negative direction. You'd say, well, wait a minute. If time is going backwards, so are all the clocks, so how could you tell? Good question. And if we sat here tonight and I asked you, how can you tell whether time is going forward or backward, you'd spend a lot of time trying ideas out and discovering that you're probably going to have a tough time telling. Because if time's going backward and all clocks are going backward, everything's relative, who cares, right? And one way says, well, how would you tell? The only way you could tell perhaps is maybe relative to another time system. Let's assume you're in a spacecraft. And let's assume there's another spacecraft, and that other spacecraft has its time going backward, and let's assume you could see it. Now, there's some light problems. I don't want to get into that. But let's assume you could watch it. And you discover a guy eating dinner, and the plate was fuller later than earlier. You'd get a little uncomfortable, wouldn't you, right? Well, in other words, if you're watching him, and as you watch him, the plate gets fuller, you'd think something strange here. And we could think of other examples where his time domain is reversed to ours. It would be peculiar. And I'm dealing just conceptually here because I want to get at another point. Suppose you and I were sitting in your parlor at home, and suppose I somehow, through this discussion, got you very concerned about whether your time is going forward or backward. How could you tell? How could you tell whether you're going forward or backward through time? There's a very easy way to tell. And if Chuck Smith will forgive me, what I would do is ask you for a deck of cards. And I would take that deck of cards and start to shuffle them. And if the deck of cards became more and more ordered, wouldn't you get uncomfortable? If I took a random deck of cards and shuffled them a few times and handed it to you and laid it out in bridge order, why would you be uncomfortable? Because you happen to know in your gut a thing called the entropy laws. All things in the universe go from order to disorder, from the complex to the simple, so to speak. It's like the universe is like a clock winding down. In the field of thermodynamics, we call it the second law of thermodynamics, where things are getting cooler, right? In the information sciences, we speak of it's the entropy laws. Things are going from order to chaos. There is a tendency towards randomness in the universe. Anytime you see something get more ordered, you're putting energy into that, you're putting design or information into the process. Now, it's interesting. Throughout the entire universe, in every field of science, those laws are observed. They're considered very fundamental, the so-called entropy laws. There's only one place that appears to be an exception. There's only one place in the entire span of knowledge of man where the entropy laws seem to be reversed, where things go from very simple rudimentary elements into a very complex structure. We call that life. The life process itself appears to be either a violation of the entropy laws or, more likely, the direct input from outside. So I'll leave that as